So you have the first strand, which I would call the humanist strand, and that is at McMaster. So while it's true that the decision was mostly pragmatic, that is not to say that there wasn't some undercurrent that helped these people make the decisions that they made. One of the oldest sources of influence there is a humanist philosopher from the 1600s, whose name in Latin is Comenius, and he's famous for writing a book called the Didactica Magna, or the Great Didactic. And he was read by the person who developed the nuts and bolts program, so Bill Spalding, as I've called him before. Comenius was a philosopher who developed the idea that students would be better off if they were left to study material at their own pace and on their own, rather than being forced to learn something by teachers. So that was quite a radical departure from scholasticism in the medieval period. And yet, even though this was a Renaissance author, somehow his advice had not been taken into account. And that's why when Spalding, who had clearly read Comenius, rediscovered these writings, he thought, this was written some centuries ago, maybe we should start applying this. Another strand of what I call humanism, it's a different type of humanism, not a philosophical humanism, but a psychological humanism. So this is a movement called humanist or third force psychology, which was developed and led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers in the 1960s. And this movement was very prominent in the US. It was born as a reaction to behaviorism and as a reaction to Freud's psychoanalysis. So their objection with behaviorism was that behaviorism basically treated people like animals and did not take into consideration the uniqueness of humans. And their objection to Freud was that Freud only saw people as sick, demented, or patients. He didn't see them as people. And so they instigated a new type of psychotherapy that was based on seeing people as people and trying to help them to so-called self-actualize or become their full potential. And he believed that if you did that, people would not suffer from psychological maladjustment, that they would become psychologically adjusted. And this rests on existentialist notions of human freedom, that we as people are all unique and all in each and every moment free to choose our own destinies. And this also had to do with education in the sense that Rogers believed that traditional education stopped people from being able to choose their own destinies because teachers would impose what you had to learn. And so to self-actualize, you had to get to a situation where you were no longer told, but you freely reached deep within your human self and found what it was that drove you to learn. And these ideas were very prominent at McMaster. They are not referred to explicitly as these are the ideas of Carl Rogers, which is why I say that unlike in Denmark where these philosophies were explicitly cited with references, at McMaster you have to dig a lot deeper to find their influence. But it's there because, for instance, one of the founding fathers in Minutes of a Meeting cited T groups. Now, T groups is a word that would only be used by Carl Rogers and in a Carl Roger context. This is a therapy group, T group. It's a group session to talk about your feelings. So we know that that was quite present, and the most significant impact that this had on McMaster was the banning of exams, which was something that Carl Rogers advocated very strongly. And also the term self-directed learning, which was featured in the founding memorandum of McMaster University in 1966, comes from Carl Rogers and his team from the Chicago University. Another prominent figure is a man that is very little known outside medical education. His name is Abraham Flexner. and he wrote in 1910 a report on the state of medical education in the US. Most people who do know about Flexner think that Flexner just wrote a survey of how medical education was done and suggested its improvements. And a lot of people accuse Flexner of being the man who divided basic science and clinical science. But if you read the Flexner report closely, that's not actually true. Flexner advocated that lectures should be done away with. Flexner said that students should start from the first moment they enter medical school in the laboratory, learning basic science through working in the wet lab. And this was obviously an idea that resonated quite strongly with John Evans, the dean of McMaster.